Hi. So, welcome to Ditch Toxic Systems so we can finally love video game romance. I had to read it because I definitely don't remember it. Thank you so much for coming, by the way. Wow, there really is like a great echo when you're standing on stage. I don't know what it sounds like for you down there, but up here it's like I hear myself, self. So, first things first, I'm going to give a content warning. My talk is going to describe a problem in media that is literally harming the consumers, which is all of us. There's nothing like exceptionally graphic, but there are a couple points in which I criticize unethical depictions of characters and a romance, which have previously been glorified, including screenshots. So I'm just putting it out there that that's in this talk. All right? We cool? Cool. But before all that, who am I even? So if you're not familiar with me already, I'm not an octopus. I just really like tentacled creatures. My name is Elie Abraham. They, them. Those are my pronouns. I'm from Helsinki, Finland. And in games, I am many, many things. These are games that I have done music for and sound design for. I am a musician, sound designer, voice actor. I have a reputation for jamming a lot. I've worked on approximately 130 jam games since the beginning of last year. And this year, I live streamed myself at a global game jam site, setting a world record when I made music for 17 games in one weekend. Hilarious. I'm mostly freelance, but I'm also half of an indie studio called Ian and Ellie, so you can guess who the other guy is in it. My writing experience actually started in the professional sense, outside of my own personal projects, started when I got a job at a company called Inside Out Escape Games, where I'm not anymore. We are most known for partnering for 20th Century Fox, and we made a Murder on the Orient Express themed escape train. It was an escape room that took place on an actual moving train with live actors and live music and all sorts of things. I'm currently writing the DLC for Dandara. If anyone here is familiar with it, it came out on Steam and the Switch earlier this year. And so that's my writing stuff now. Outside of games, I am a queer activist and model. I regularly do educational and motivational speaking gigs like this one, as well as performances like DJing and stand-up comedy. And I'm the host for the first ever live game dev stand-up comedy series called Funny Equals True. And so now you know some of my work, but I'm also telling you all this because I want you to know that if you want to come up to me, especially after giving Martin's talk for anyone who saw it, and talk to someone who does many things also while traveling, feel free to come talk to me, either about careers in or out of games, or how we make it happen on the move. So yeah, feel free. But for the sake of this talk, let's start with a confession. I'm a sucker for romance in video games, like romantic subplots, optional romances. Anybody else? Can we make noise? Yeah, I guess that's why you're coming to my talk. Woo, thank you. Yeah, I'm a sucker for that stuff. I love that. But why is it disappointing 9 out of 10 times? Those systems and stories are so... they're really disappointing so often. And this talk is essentially about why that's even happening. Like, intimate exploration is so important to my life, so I want it in my games. In fact, romantic love in general is very central in society. Not because it should be, not even because it is to individuals, we made it that way. And it seems to be representing itself in our media, of course. But romance in games rarely ever actually speak to me. It's generally fan service and wish fulfillment, often in a very sexual way. Can you believe they gave Edie camel toe in the third Mass Effect? Yeah, it's really cringeworthy. I didn't even know about that until I started doing research for this talk. And I discovered that. And it's, oh God, I'm not going to look at it. You look at it. So fan service and wish fulfillment might be enjoyable because we're literally having our dreams and desires catered to, but how frequently does one's fantasies represent reality? How frequently are fantasies even possible in reality? And maybe you're hearing this question and thinking, who cares? Why does it matter? Why is this a problem? It matters because the values of society are represented in media. When our media is a representation of our values, it also becomes a model for the values we aim to maintain in society. If we create a medium that is designed to encompass wish fulfillment, we are actively participating in a system that fosters the feeling of entitlement, which is very dangerous, especially when it comes to romance. Now, before I continue, I want to make it painfully clear that I don't mean that every single piece of media is a representation of society's values as a whole. So please, I can't dive into this distinction for the sake of time too much in this talk, but please accept the fact that not every book, movie, game is a representation of society's values as a whole. Each one is essentially like a micro image of values in society. But if we pay attention to the fact that there are trends and systems across media, that effectively gives us the macro image of our values. And that is a representation of our values in society. An example of this would be the fact that many of us saw Disney films with princes and princesses growing up, where the storyline required the prince to save the princess, and she always fell in love with the prince at the end. And I loved many of those movies. But as a society, we started to speak up against that trend that I just described. And how do we know this? Because it was represented in our media. Disney, for example, made The Princess and the Frog, which literally turned the previous trope upside down in its head and makes the story focused on the journey of the princess. Disney made Frozen, in which the prince actually turned out to be the bad guy, and the true love was actually the bond between the two sisters. But of course, still includes a romance. Perhaps it was a nod to our struggle to let go of the trend I'm describing, as seen in the small kiss shared between Anna and Kristoff. A scene in which, by the way, Kristoff stumbles over being like, "I'd like to kiss you. I mean, may I? Can we? And then they do. Which, if that is not an expression of the fact that there is an ongoing developing discourse around consent in society, then I don't know what is. But back to games. Now, I told you that I'm a sucker for romances, and I told you that they're often very disappointing for me. In fact, the stories that encompass intimacies in games that I've often found most compelling are either tragic or barely spoken. And I'll come back to that. First, let's consider why it is that game romances are often a letdown. For starters, it's felt like video game stories, or at least their dialogue, have been so subpar for so long. And any game you're convinced challenges this is an exception. And I'm saying, like consider that only in more recent times, let's say the past 10 years plus, or whatever, which maybe tells you how old I am, but 10 years, give or take, have video games started to feel like a medium we could count on to contain a compelling narrative in the way that we feel moves and impresses us like, and I'm sorry for the go-to comparison, literature, film. When playing all our favorite titles, it felt like the best we could hope was for a game devoid of cliches. Now, there are tons of moving game experiences to indulge in, and writing in games is improving still, but romances still tend to be seriously lacking. Some of the games you see here, however, are games that were doing it right. And this isn't exclusive to games at all. Society right now is basically warring over how romance should be experienced and thus how it should be depicted. And we're seeing an ongoing shift on this front from intense developments in call-out culture to more efforts in understanding and defining and teaching consent. Suddenly, our action heroes from the 80s and the 90s don't seem as irresistibly sexy, but actually privileged and rapey. I'm pointing fingers at James Bond literally holding down Pussy Galore trying to struggle to get away from him in Goldfinger. I'm pointing fingers at Indiana Jones reeling Willie into his arms with his whip when she was storming away from him in Temple of Doom. And you want to know why that's a problem? Because I loved these movies growing up. I loved James Bond and I loved Indiana Jones. I looked up to people who were doing things that I now retrospectively know were doing things that were immoral. In a society where we haven't been teaching the truthful nature of these happenings, in fact, we tend to disguise it, like with pretty music that romanticizes the struggle. It masks what is actually occurring. And this is misguiding the consumer, us, in a way that's wildly irresponsible. And now, years later, it's disenchanting and upsetting for all of us who are opening our eyes to the reality, which is also why, for many of us, our first reaction is to get defensive or angry because they're hard pills to swallow. I'm not saying that we have to stop loving James Bond or Indiana Jones. But I am saying that if we're going to continue to do so, and for the record, I still love Indy, we have to do so knowing that these films were done at a time where depictions of romance were even more problematic than now, and honestly just catering to male fantasies. But more importantly, we have to do better going forward. So here's another princess story we've all heard about before, and some points we need to make about it. I am so done with the damsel in distress trope. I don't care which castle the princess is in. I want to know why the princess was made to be so fragile, in need of Mario, and required to reward him with love. Like, shared trauma can actually be bonding, but who actually thinks that saving someone would immediately lead to love? Now, in the intro sequence of Super Mario Sunshine, the only character who seems to be suspicious of the happenings of Delfino Island is Princess Peach. Mario and Toad are too distracted by food and luxury to even notice when she's speaking to them. And then you carry on playing as, Super Mario, the idiot who wasn't paying attention. Everything about that intro scene is what we normally do when we're trying to set up the player to realize that Princess Peach would have been the main character. Our games have been dominated by men who grew up with the previously mentioned 80s and 90s heroes, developing corresponding expectations capable of saving the world, but not asking for consent. And if you're writing characters like that, then you're not the person I want writing characters, let alone my romances. I've never played the episodic adventure Life is Strange, so if some people saw this picture and were like, woo, you're on your own, because I haven't played it. Which also means I have no place to critique it. And I'll say now that I know nothing about the DLC, so anything I'm about to say is about Life is Strange when it first came out. I want to tell you about why I didn't play it. I'm just not interested in what adult men think a lesbian teenage romance is like. And the voice for representation by those being represented was pretty loud when it came out in 2015. If we're looking for change, then who are we looking to help make it happen? Where are our models? Because what we have right now is not cutting it. Maybe someone here would say that I'm being too harsh. And maybe my nose up in the air skepticism is an overreaction, but I grew up with Final Fantasy X showing its face as people's idea of what a romance in games should be like. And the tale of Titus and Yuna, two people incredibly unfit for each other, was epic and grandiose. It was iconic in the way that Romeo and Juliet is. But no one should actually believe that a romance like that is healthy or desirable, even. It was a must-have story element. Not a piece of narrative that was actually moving. It was fantastical. But what I'm calling for is relatable. The former is an abstract representation of love. We recognize it. But for many of us, it doesn't fill us with emotion anymore. We're over it. The latter, however, is asking to see our lived experiences and values represented in the art we engage. But we don't just have unrealistic ideas of love. Video games are also filled with a toxic degree of wish fulfillment And sex in video games is often depicted and expected as the reward for following through with specific quests or merely accumulating enough points or however else it's numerically or graphically measured. We literally allow players to continue living in game worlds where we upkeep the notion that these are valid expectations of romantic relationships. So it's no wonder that people feel entitled. How do these systems often work? With kindness tokens. And I'd like to explain kindness tokens as a system to you in a way that perhaps will feel a bit familiar. 3 steps for sleeping with anyone and you'll never believe how easy they are. Step 1. Agree with all of their opinions or they will like you less and you'll see the numbers go down. I don't know how you could ever expect to learn from another person if this is how conversations work. Step 2, give them gifts. They don't care how many monsters you have to slay. They don't care how much in harm's way you are. They just want those diamonds. Step 3, do their side quest. Show your loved one how much you care by going to the other side of the galaxy and finding their long-lost father. That's how you get someone to have sex with you. And the sex always comes at the end. It's the reward we're all eagerly awaiting and expecting. A powerful biotic named Jack joins your crew in Mass Effect 2 and is one of the available romance options. You have the option to have sex with her earlier versus later in the game, and if you do, she will stop speaking to you. Some people might say, like, but yeah, man, Kelly told you that you have to wait, because you want her to respect you. Blah, blah, blah. Well, that's just another moment to ask why we're teaching people that they can't have sex before jumping through all these hoops to prove that they respect someone. In fact, I want to ask, why is the default assumption that we don't respect someone or ourselves unless we wait to have sex? Why are we glorifying chastity? I've heard horror stories from people about their sex education where they're like, my teacher came to class with a rose and pulled off a petal and was like, every time you have sex, it's like taking a petal off this rose and nobody wants a naked rose. Or they busted out a lollipop and they're like, every time you have sex with someone, it's like licking the lollipop. And who wants to lick a lollipop that's been licked by other people? That's literally what's being represented in video games. No, it's about Jack's trauma. No. That's, again, the mask that we're putting over the narrative that we perpetuate in society, that someone is a slut if they have sex frequently with people. And being a slut is also apparently a bad thing. Because nobody wants a naked rose. Now, if you had asked someone decades ago about the scene in Goldfinger, they probably would have been like, no, you see, she actually wants it. That's why they put the pretty music in the background. And she kisses him in the end. Wake up, sheeple! In Stardew Valley, you can literally give a person a diamond twice a week from the moment you meet them without ever otherwise speaking to them, and it will lead to marriage. I've enjoyed the hell out of playing Stardew Valley, but bluntly, kindness token systems disgust me. Could you imagine doing that in real life? Like if I've never met you before, but if I just came up and here's a diamond. A couple days later, here's another. I'll be back next week. And then at the end of the month, I'm like, we're getting married. You know how many slimes I had to kill? We're teaching players that you put in kindness, you put in coins of kindness, and sex and or marriage comes out. Your progress may even be marked, for example, with a number of hearts that indicate how much a given person likes you, like in Stardew Valley. You can even see the crosses to show that you've given 2 gifts a week, which is the maximum, because after that, it starts to feel like too much. I mean, if I just showed up just now and gave you the diamond, not too much, but if I did it for a 3rd time in a week, hey-oh. Calm down, Ellie. Or a sliding scale a la Dragon Age Origins. Here you can see that plus 19 approval still only counts as neutral. And the text there reads, party members' approval changes based on plot decisions or gifts. High approval provides possible romance options. So I just make plot decisions and approve that they approve of and give them gifts. Nailed it. Stud. There is no emotional growth in this completely empty exchange. Nor do we even consider the fact that sex and or marriage is actually undesirable for many people in their intimacies. Plus, again, the relationships often seen end right after the sex or marriage. The love interest just moves into your house and occasionally says something if you talk to them. So you were like questing with someone, but now that you're married, hello, shepherd. I don't know what this is. I'm assuming she's doing something with her hands, like, you know. She, if it was Jack. But isn't that when the interesting parts of relationships are supposed to start? Like once you're actually together? Like your partners don't just become trophies. You don't like just go to your friends like, me and so are dating now. Haven't spoken to them in a month, but you know how many diamonds it took? Like what if your love interest would occasionally offer a side quest that was like to do something intimate together? And I don't mean even sexually, just something sweet. What if you're like you came home and it's like, hey, I was thinking we could do blank together. And that could reflect itself in the story. What if taking your romance interest with you in the party gave you bonuses or even penalties? And that too could reflect itself in the story. So maybe some people are thinking, but we'd have to hire extra people to make all that possible in a game. Whoa. It's almost like it requires writers and designers to create convincing stories in romance systems. Who would have known? So the FAQable nature of romance systems also keeps players from playing the way I think they should. The way they would handle a romance in the real world. Like when we play a game, the moment we realize someone is romanceable, Google, Mass Effect, Jack, romance, follow the steps, stud. But in the real world, we handle romance with like beads of sweat and nervousness. We're like adjusting our clothes. We're powdering our noses. We're hoping the other person thinks we're decent and isn't judging us because we said, hey, with too many Ys. We're editing our last message to take the emoji out of it because we're worried that it was too flirty. Like that's what it's like to flirt or have romance in the real world. But in video games, it's Mass Effect, Jack, romance. We're feeling terrified of putting ourselves out there, and we're not willing to put that in our games for some reason, because that's where the heart of intimacy really is. The romance systems in games should encourage us to behave the way we should in the real world, both because the way they stand right now is literally a danger to players, and because different systems would be relatable to our actual experiences with romance. This is also how we create romance systems in games that are empowering. Video games are the perfect opportunity to create low-pressure models that allow us to practice this. Like, of course, one might think, well, isn't being kind and giving gifts, like a good example? Well, I'm obviously not against being kind and giving gifts, but in games, this is always transactional at best, and always led by the expectation of sex and or marriage at the end of the game. The first Witcher takes it a step further by making sex collectible, by awarding players a card for every person the protagonist Geralt slept with. I realized I made my content warning before this slide, where I was like, trust me, nothing's too graphic. Whoops. Are you telling me that Stardew Valley's Pelican Town really doesn't have a single character that doesn't want a cake or a diamond or a bottle of wine twice a week? No character who just wants a mixtape or to bake or doesn't want gifts at all? Developers can come up with this boring system with the insane card gimmick, can give you a robot with camel toe, but you can't make relationships better than this? Hire me and I will. In replaying Dragon Age Origins, years ago, I unknowingly locked myself into a romance with party members Morrigan and Liliana simply by not realizing that the game read a number of my dialogue choices as being flirty. And when I returned to speak to Liliana at the party camp, she brought up how our relationship cannot be because I see how it is between you and Morrigan. And I chose the only dialogue option the game gave me to not break her heart. I lied to her. Not only did I lie to her, I unlocked an achievement for passing a high charisma check by lying to my loved one about my other loved one. Like, if this was my actual life, what would have happened would have been like, we can't be together because you're with someone else. Why can't I be with both of you? It doesn't work that way. Maybe it could work that way. I've never thought about that before. Maybe it's time to think about it. You know what? Maybe this could work. Of course it could work. And then later on in the game, you find out she lied about it being cool. Now that would speak to my life experience. Thank you. Or maybe she just says, no, I don't want to do that. We're done. Or like, hey, I've actually tried out non-exclusive dating. It doesn't work for me. Sometimes people in our circles, in the real world, date each other. Surprise. How come NPC characters never romance each other? Like, there is the smallest nod to this in Mass Effect 3 when Tali and Garrus are holding each other, as you can see here. Shepard walks in and they go, oh, Shepard. And he goes, I'm happy for you. That's it. That's all that happens. Like, and it's literally the only time I've seen it happen in games. Because the romance option is always the plaything of the player to pick up or leave. It's always about you. But in the real world, romance is not exclusively about you, which it feels like it increasingly always is in games. Romances in games feel best not when achieved, but when developed into something mutual. Like our actual relationships. It was a secret from me to you. I'd like to visit a couple games that did have romantic elements that I particularly appreciated. The first is Shadow of the Colossus. Not the first game to come to people's mind when talking about romance. Light spoilers, in the beginning of the game, like the pre-menu cutscene, you see this like really cool camera angle swooping down onto this mountain as you see Wander, the main character, the protagonist, riding a horse with some massive package on the back, and he's going across the lands. He goes into this strange temple. He goes to this altar. He picks up the thing on the back of the horse, puts it on the altar, takes away the sheet that's covering it to release Mono, a deceased woman. While it's never directly communicated, there's an immediate assumption of romance, which might just be, again, because that's the kind of thing we're expecting when we see that in our media. Less light spoilers. You spend the entire game just slaying the Colossi. One after another. That is the entire game of Shadow of the Colossus. And every time you do, you don't notice it at first, but every time you do, Wander gets a little more sick. Now, what I'm pointing out here is that this character is just over and over sacrificing for Mono. Proper spoilers. So if you want to play this game and you don't want to know what happens, la 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 for the next minute, all right? Shadow of the Colossus ultimately ends with him giving up everything to bring her back. He slays all the Colossi and he gives away his own life. And that was incredible. He gives away everything to bring her back, and he never even gets to experience it. You see the strength of the bond between these two characters through everything you are literally playing throughout the entire game. And because she is deceased, there is no opportunity for the game to have ruined it with some cheesy or cliche lines. You just see it over and over again. You watch the entire game as he's getting sicker. It's getting harder. The struggle is greater. And then he's gone in the end. Sorta. The romance is just driven by the commitment of the hero. And here's another interesting thing. He doesn't save her and then she falls in love with him. They had a romantic relationship first. So now there's actually incentive for him to save her, because I have no idea why Super Mario is saving Princess Peach. This is a classic example of show not tell, which in a world where video game story and dialogue has been so disappointing, resulted in a stronger story of romance. Again, remember this game is 13 years old. The second game I'd like to speak of is actually a revisit to Mass Effect 2. Now, while this game is mostly my example of how not to do romance in games, there was one situation that did catch my attention. So, spoilers if anybody wants to romance Samara, that's what I'm talking about. The character Samara is a Justicar. Described as a sort of knight or samurai speaking words, what's that? English. So, a samurai or knight who follows like a strict code, and when you try to make any of these romantic advances on her, she's like, I can't, I have this strict code. Not because the code says I can't, but she's married to her work. And if you choose to continue pursuing her anyway, there's a scene where you're about to share a kiss, and then she cuts things off. She's just like, wait, I can't. She walks over dramatically to the window. She looks off out at the stars. And if you try to talk to her, she just says, Shepard, please. End of relationship with Samara. That's it. That's where it ends. Like, all attempts after that are immediately pushed away. Any further romantic interaction is impossible. And this is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking in a way that we can actually relate to. It's tragic in a way that makes it both relatable and interesting. And that is a compelling element in a tale of romance. What is unfortunate is that it ends there. Of course, the moment we realize she's not going to have sex with us, we don't need to write any more dialogue for her. That's just literally where the storyline ends. Now, most of us have experienced heartbreak and rejection, and we know how severely devastating it is. A much stronger tale of heartbreak would have explored the effects of that failed romance on Shepard, or shown further how it affected Samara. But unfortunately, the models of romance systems in those games are driven by wish fulfillment, and it's assumed that nobody wants to play a game looking to get their heart broken. But guess what? I want games with heartbreak. Some of us want to see compelling stories of intimacy, and it might require some tragedy to pull that off. Now, I'm not saying that your game needs heartbreak to have a good romance story. I'm just saying we shouldn't act like, that's not interesting, because it totally is. The third game I'd like to mention, with the time that I have remaining, is Tusks. Tusks is an indie gay orc dating simulator. Yeah. So here's a couple cool things that Tusks did right. First, diversity in type of romanceable characters. And I don't mean the sporty one, the art nerd, the academic one. I don't mean that at all. I mean there's a disabled character. There are characters with different kinds of facial and body hair. Stretch marks even. But what really blew me away about this game is a feature called NPC autonomy, which you can turn off, but I don't know why any would, because it's, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the game. NPC autonomy allows other characters to essentially veto your decisions. In the beginning of the game, you, the player, are asked to name your traveling band of orcs. Anything you want. I named mine the Squid Squad, because I love tentacled creatures. But then they voted on it. They voted, should our band be called the Squid Squad? like the rest of the NPCs voted on if they would accept it. And that means that there's a point in the game when they can ask you, should we go left or should we go right? And you, the player, get to decide, are we going to go left or right? And you can pick left. But if NPC autonomy is on, they'll then vote on it. And they might do the other thing. which is incredible. It's an incredible way for a game to explore a world where everything isn't always up to the player, like the real world. Where we can even explore being rejected in a way that teaches us to be emotionally ready for the experience of rejection. So this talk couldn't on its own be completely comprehensive, nor do I have all the answers. But there is so much to say, and we clearly need to keep having this discourse. This conversation needs to keep going. Media is a part of what tells us what kind of relationships we can have. We are affected by what we see and what is on offer. Like, has anyone ever considered that part of why we think we need to share a home and a room with our partners is because family homes are literally designed to have a master bedroom? Like, that's how suburbs happen. They're like, hey, we'll just pick a place. We build a lot of homes with the same architectural structure, I guess you should say, with the master bedroom, because there's the assumption that that's what people are all going to want. And then we see that as being the only model available. And that's part of how suburbs become what they are, and why the types of family units that live there are always the same. But many of us, especially in the forward-thinking, progressive, and playful world of video games, are exploring other paths. And if romances are so integral to our society, and to many of our individual ways of living, then why can't video games reflect our real-world experiences instead of offering us these crude systems that effectively just trivialize our playable character's path to sex and marriage? Have any of you ever been on a date and had a friend tell you to just be yourself? Anybody? Has anyone ever told you just be yourself when you were going on a date? Yeah, exactly, right? We need a video game that can say that to us. Like, where we're like, I don't know how to romance this character, and there's no guide online. And the game makes you feel like you should just be yourself. And then you realize that it might not work out. Because that's what the real world is like. And like in the real world, it'll feel that much more special when you do find someone it works with. Thanks. So, do we have a little bit of time for questions? I straight up can't really see the audience that well with this light, just like. Yeah. All right, cool. Questions, anybody? Also, I'll be around the conference if you want to come talk to me at any point. This guy right here.
Hey. So you talk about how romance or sex is built as a reward, in a sense, rather than a realistic goal to strive for. Do you think that has partly to do with how the rest of the game system in a lot of games is centered around how every action you do is expected to give you a reward? You get good loot, or you get to meet the next boss, or that sort of thing.
Definitely. I absolutely think that. I think it's like we've had all these mechanics in games, and this is how we've been doing it, so now we're going to introduce this new thing, and it's inspired by the other mechanics that we have in the game. That's also a problem, because a lot of people are not looking for that same reward system. There are actually a lot of really good game talks on this that you could even find on the internet. Love Drugs is an example, where we talk about how many different people have different, what is appealing to them. Like, for example, players who play a lot of games, I give the example of Mass Effect, shooting games give you an adrenaline rush. That is one of our stress response systems that is being utilized when they're deciding how they want to reward the player. But a lot of people want their rewards to happen differently in games. But we're using old systems that have been tried over and over again, and as I called them earlier in my talk, they feel kind of crude to me. And they don't think they allow for the flexibility that a very rewarding romance system would need in a game. It's a great question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Honestly, I just really wanted to say thank you for keeping your talk about romance, because there's obviously a lot of sexualization as well, but I'm really glad that it wasn't centered around, trying to romance one gender. I mean, it's usually the male gaze, but like in Stardew Valley, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's just been something that's been bothering me, and I don't know why,
It's been bothering me too. I'll point out a thing that even bothered me about Stardew Valley, which is I have a tendency, so I'm non-binary, and I have a tendency to play women in games if I have to choose, because men just feel alien to me. And in Stardew Valley, I romanced a character, and we got married, because that's what you gotta do. And when we got married, the mayor said, "I now pronounce you wife and, wife." As if like the mayor trying to seem like, cool, it's normal, but that's actually not how you normalize something. That was like this guy not knowing how to mask his discomfort with homosexuality, for example. So, again, I try to lay off saying all the time, like, male fantasies, male fantasies, male fantasies. But hey, guys, male fantasies! It really is dominating a lot. Why does Edie have camel toe? What? Or like you saw the covers that I showed of Catherine. Women did not design those, which again brought me back to my point when I was talking about Life is Strange. There were two main writers on that game. They were two men, and as I said, I'm not interested in what they think a lesbian teenage romance is like. Thank you, by the way, for your kind words. One more question, maybe?
I have a question about your use of the word romance.
Oh, that's so good. I'm panicking already.
No, I just wonder, because you almost used it interchangeably with the word intimacy. And I'm wondering if that isn't actually an important distinction, that maybe there are other... Because romance, again, suggests, I don't know, it brings up to me a lot of connotations that are more traditionalized romantic connotations, whereas other kinds of patterns or ways in which you can develop intimacy that can be very intriguing and rewarding and that don't depend on, I don't know, the expectation of romance. That could be another way of deepening the ways we even just think about what relationships are and how we build them.
Absolutely, like 100%. And you're speaking to something I've been spending a lot of my later life trying to explore in my personal life. And there were times where I said romance and what I meant was intimacy. And they are not the same. And I have intimate relationships that are not romantic in the way that people think, and oftentimes people use them interchangeably. And I think there were times where I did it intentionally here, and there were times where I did it unintentionally here. And some of the times I did mean intimacy. Romance was the term I wanted to focus on, partly because that is the term we're using to discuss these systems and what we're saying like, this is the romance option. And when you actually do Google things and look for the FAQ on how to find the one person you're trying to romance, that's always the word that's used in there. But part of why I also wanted to use the word intimacy is because that's part of what I think we should be bringing into games. And so I was jumping back and forth a little bit and blurring that line. At times, blurring the line was intentional, and at times, I did mean intimacy when I meant romance. When I said romance. Thank you for that question. That was good. Hey, thank you everyone so much. I really, really appreciate that you came out, and stick around for Emily Buck's talk because it's going to be amazing, especially given what happened at Telltale. I'm Elie Abraham. See you around.